Well, let's expand on this further and look into the policy, particularly around the drivers of unemployment. We're joined by Khaya Sithole, who is an independent analyst. Khaya, always a pleasure chatting to you. So when we look at this problem of unemployment, we can barely begin to talk about this marginal difference. It doesn't take away from the impact it has had on those people that have been able to get jobs or stay in jobs. But the reality is the scale of the problem we're dealing with is so big that the only time we can talk about progress is when it's significant enough.
Yes, good afternoon to the viewers. So I do think that generally, whenever you see a marginal decrease in unemployment, it is something to be celebrated. In the South African context, however, the problem that we always highlight is that these changes do not actually come on the back of a coordinated, clear program of action by the government that says, look, in the past 3 to 6 months, this is what we've done, so therefore this is why the numbers are like this. It really all just seems to be left to the vagaries and the quest of good fortune, where we hope that employers just simply pick enough people within the employment bracket in order for us to see the changes in the numbers. And why that's particularly problematic is that we may see this downslide in unemployment this month, but then in the next report, we're going to see it going up because the state itself is not in control of what the primary drivers of employment, as you say, are going to be. So in this particular instance, what we seem to be lacking is a very clear program of action that says that over the next 3, 6 to 9 months, this is what we are going to do as a state. This is what we're going to put as infrastructure projects, for example, so that it employs a number of people, which then is going to make this particular impact on the unemployment statistics. The state is essentially a bystander where they probably discover the data at around the same time that you and I discover it, which is when Stats SA releases it, and that's not an ideal way in which to run this particular economy.
Khaya, what's really gone wrong? Because when President Cyril Ramaphosa took office, unemployment, and in particular youth unemployment, was a very clear target of his administration. And there were so many plans around how it is that the government was going to scale up unemployment. At some point, we had figures of, putting 1 million people, 1 million young people in jobs. Of course, what we have now seen is the job opportunities versus actual long-term sustainable employment for young people.
So we do have to distinguish between political rhetoric, which simply says that we want to, or we're committing to creating 1 million or 2 million jobs, for example, versus the substantive program of action that then says we've done X, Y, Z, and ensuring that it becomes as economically absorbing as it can be. So if you talk, for example, about an infrastructure project or an infrastructure rollout program, the expectation is that, of course, you want the hard infrastructure to be put on the ground, but also in the process of doing so to not only onboard as many people during the construction phase, if you want to call it that, but also to be able to create opportunities for permanent employment on the back of the infrastructure that has been created there. So it's much more important for us to then ask the government, what are the programs that you're putting in place? And then the actual number, whether it's 1 million or 2 million jobs, becomes the byproduct rather than the primary focus. And unfortunately, when we then look at what has happened in our political ecosystem, we spend too much time talking about the ideals, those ambitious numbers, rather than asking what is the substance of the program of implementation, what is the private sector going to be doing, what is the government going to be doing in order for us to be able to say the net result is going to be many more people being onboarded into this economy. And until we get that right, unfortunately, that type of rhetoric is something that we're going to not only see scaling up ahead of the general election next year, but also the numbers are going to be even more ambitious. But many more South Africans have now come to accept that the ambition that you hear in those particular numbers is never matched by the actual efforts that we see on the ground.
Khaya, you bring me to my next point. In an election cycle, of course, there are lots of gimmicks that, one should also pay attention to. It's clear that jobs are going to be a big issue, especially jobs for young people. We just have to take a look at what has been happening in Gauteng and the campaign to get young people in jobs. What are we to make of that, especially given the more substantive issue that you've raised tonight about the fact that if there's to be true progress, it has to be followed by a clear plan of action that we as a society are able to track?
Yeah, and you think, I mean, the Gauteng example is a particularly important one because you'd imagine that when we heard about the type of program that Premier Panyaza Lesufi was putting in place, for example, I think you and I would agree that in every economy there is a particular issue relating to crime. So, of course, if the government has said, wait, hold on, one way in which you can actually do the two things at once, in other words, tackle the scourge and the persistence of crime and also onboard more people into the employment, is to put a program together like the Nasser program, then of course that shouldn't be a Gauteng solution. It should be a universal solution because every community's got the same problem. And if you're saying that this is the one thing that can address two fundamental social issues, which is crime and unemployment, then of course it should be a matter of government policy rather than a question of the discretion of the Gauteng government. And that for me is where the limitations come in, where it doesn't look like all the role players sit together and say, guys, for the country at large, this is some of the issues that exist. These are the resources that we have. These are the skills and the competencies that exist in our communities. So therefore, let us actually have a coordinated program of action that then enables as many more people to say, look, at least we're seeing how we've been onboarded into the economy. So in the absence of that coherent framework, it then becomes a matter of good fortune. So you'd have heard, Kathy, today that when you listen to the statistician general, he will then say in the Western Cape, for example, they've got the lowest unemployment rate. They seem to have found a way of getting many more people to be onboarded into the economy. Well, the issue here shouldn't be the question that, oh, the Western Cape has done it, good for them. It should be a question of, wait, Western Cape, what have you done in order to be able to do this? Because if perhaps our next target should be, let us have the unemployment rate that is the same as the Western Cape, which is around 20%, then at least we're all working towards a similar program of action. Every single province then says, with the resources that we have, with the issue, with the capacity that exists within our particular province, this is what we're going to do in order to get there. And unfortunately, far too much of these particular policy conversations get lost in the politicking, and a lot of people then still remain left out, which is why you're seeing this unemployment remaining as persistently high as it is.
Khaya Sithole, thank you so much for your time tonight.